I'm 78 years old. I've been retired for 14 years, and if I could go back to the day I left work, I'd tell my 64-year-old self 5 things he didn't want to hear. 5 things that would have completely changed how I lived the last decade. He wouldn't have listened, of course, I know that. Because at 64, I was certain I had it all figured out. Savings in order, house paid off, a wife I'd shared my life with for decades, 2 grown children, and the quiet promise that finally time would be mine. I wasn't naive. I was the logical product of everything the culture taught me about retirement. Work hard, save money, and one day you'll enjoy the rewards. What nobody told me, and what took me years to understand, is that enjoying the rewards requires knowing what you planted. And I, with all my discipline and planning, had planted almost nothing outside of work. My granddaughter asked me a question 3 years ago. She was about 12. We'd had a Sunday lunch, the whole family, the house loud and alive, the way it only gets when small children are running through it. And in the middle of all that noise, she looked at me with that unfiltered honesty only a child has and said, "Grandpa, what do you do all day?" I laughed. Said something like, "I enjoy life." But when they left that evening and the house went quiet again, that question stayed. It just sat there in the silence. What did I do all day? The honest answer was, very little I could describe with any pride or even any clarity. I'd wake up without an alarm, watch the news, read a little, eat lunch, nap, walk when my body allowed it, have dinner, watch something on television, sleep, and repeat. It wasn't unhappiness. It was something worse, an existence on autopilot that I'd confused with well-earned rest. That Sunday I realized I'd been resting for over 10 years, and the rest had become the void itself. A study by AgeWave found that 62% of retirees say the emotional side of retirement is harder than the financial side. 62%, more than half. And I was one of them for over a decade without knowing it, because nobody frames retirement as an emotional challenge. It's always about money, always about the numbers. The emotional part, the existential part, that's treated as something you'll figure out along the way. You won't, not unless you do it deliberately. I didn't, and it cost me years. If you're watching this and you feel like something is off about your retirement, but you can't quite name it, if the days are comfortable but somehow weightless, if you're technically fine but quietly empty, I want you to know that what you're feeling is real, and it's more common than anyone admits. I'm not here to give you a formula. I don't have one. What I have is 14 years of mistakes that I only began to see clearly about 3 years ago, when that question from a 12-year-old forced me to stop and actually look at how I'd been living. In the days that followed, I did something I hadn't done since my working years. I sat down with a blank notebook, not to plan, not to set goals, just to write down what was true. And from those pages, patterns emerged. My mistakes weren't random. Each one led to the next, like links in a chain I could only see now, with the distance that 14 years of retirement provides. What I want to share with you are those links, not as lessons from someone who figured it all out, but as honest observations from someone who took far too long to see what was right in front of him. The moment that cracked everything open happened on an ordinary afternoon about 3 years ago. I'd been retired for 11 years by then. 11 years. My granddaughter's question had been rattling around in my head for days. And one evening I was sitting in the living room, television on, volume low, not really watching. My wife was in the kitchen, and I had this thought, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a quiet, brutal thought. I have been furnishing a house with no foundation. That image stayed with me, because that's exactly what I'd done. I'd planned my retirement the way you'd furnish a house. Chose the right furniture, decorated every room, got the lighting just so. From the outside, it looked complete, comfortable, enviable even. But I'd never checked the foundation. And over 14 years, the cracks had been spreading. Small at first, easy to ignore, then bigger. And by the time I noticed, the structural problems had been there all along. I'd just been too busy admiring the furniture to look down. That metaphor became my way of understanding every mistake I'd made. And the first one, the one that set everything else in motion, was this. When I retired, I believed I had earned the right to do nothing. And for the first few months, that nothing was glorious. I slept late, had long, unhurried lunches, spent entire afternoons reading or watching films. I told myself, I deserve this. And I did. After decades of working, I deserved rest. The problem is that months became years, and I deserved to rest transformed into a permanent justification for inertia. I remember a morning, maybe 2 years into retirement. My wife asked if I wanted to go with her to an art exhibition at a cultural center near our house. I said no. Said I'd rather stay home and rest. She looked at me and said, with a gentleness that made the observation cut even deeper, "Rest from what?" I didn't answer, because the honest answer was, from nothing. I was resting from nothing. I had turned well-earned rest into an entire identity, and that identity was slowly hollowing me out. Now, I know some people hearing this might think, what's wrong with resting? He worked for decades. Let the man enjoy his time. And I'd agree, completely. Rest is not the enemy. What happened to me wasn't rest. It was what rest becomes when it has no counterweight. Martin Seligman, the psychologist who founded positive psychology, mapped out what humans actually need to thrive, not just to feel okay, but to genuinely flourish. He identified 5 things: positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and a sense of accomplishment. Resting, the pleasant, undemanding kind of rest I'd made my whole life, covers maybe the first one, partially. The other 4 go completely unserved. And here's the part that haunts me. Research from the Institute of Economic Affairs found that retirement increases the probability of clinical depression by about 40%. But the cruelest detail is that these effects don't show up immediately. They emerge gradually over the first several years, precisely when most retirees believe they're living the best time of their lives. I was one of them, thought I was thriving, was actually eroding. If you retired and spent the first years feeling like you were finally getting the rest you deserved, and now you're starting to notice that the rest has turned into something that looks uncomfortably like stagnation, you didn't fail. You did what anyone would do after decades of work. The problem was never resting. It was not noticing the moment when rest stopped being recovery and became avoidance. I once spent an entire afternoon reorganizing my book collection by color instead of by author, and genuinely convinced myself I was being productive. Told my wife about it at dinner like it was an accomplishment. She just stared at me. That stare contained more diagnostic accuracy than any psychology paper. But that posture of, I've earned the right to do nothing, opened the door to a second mistake that, looking back, cost far more than I realized at the time. My relationship with my body had always been basically reactive. When something hurt, I went to the doctor. When the annual checkup came back clean, I celebrated and returned to the same habits. Never smoked, drank in moderation, figured that made me healthy. When I retired, I kept the same logic, annual checkup and nothing else. I didn't exercise in any real way. I'd walk occasionally, but without regularity, without intention, without actual effort. I thought staying active meant not being bedridden. By 70, the consequences started arriving. 2 flights of stairs left me winded. The right knee I'd been ignoring for years started seriously limiting what I could do. I lost enough balance to become afraid of uneven sidewalks. None of this happened at once. It happened so gradually that each small loss seemed insignificant, but the sum was devastating. At 72, my children invited me on a trip that included walking on uneven terrain. I said it wasn't my thing. The truth was my body wouldn't allow it anymore. And that limitation wasn't age. It was accumulated negligence. Age contributed, no question. But I had accelerated the process by years, maybe decades, through inaction. The World Health Organization makes a distinction that I wish someone had explained to me at 55. The difference between chronological aging and functional aging. 2 people the same age can be decades apart in what their bodies can do, depending on their history of physical activity. Roger Fielding at Tufts University has documented that the loss of muscle mass and strength after 60 accelerates dramatically without resistance exercise, and that this loss is the single strongest predictor of losing independence in old age. But here's what matters most. Significant gains in strength and balance are possible even when started at 70, 75, or 80. It's not too late. But every year of postponement makes the road back longer and steeper. If you're noticing that your body no longer does what it did 5 or 10 years ago, and you feel that mix of frustration and guilt, I understand completely. The frustration is legitimate. The guilt is understandable, but less useful than it seems. What matters now isn't mourning what wasn't done. It's starting with what still can be, even if it's less than you'd like, even if the starting point is humble. I wish I could say I corrected this immediately. I didn't. I started small, very small. Some mornings embarrassingly small, but I started. And at 78, I'm stronger than I was at 75. Which isn't saying much, but it's saying something. But while I was neglecting my body, something even more invisible was being neglected. Something I only noticed when it was almost too late. When I worked, I had what I called friends. Colleagues I ate lunch with, people I talked to in hallways, project partners who shared frustrations and victories. When I retired, those contacts evaporated within months. First year, there were still some sporadic lunches, occasional phone calls. Second year, almost nothing. Third year, complete silence. It wasn't their fault. I didn't call either. None of us made the effort because, and this is the uncomfortable truth, those relationships depended on the context of work to exist. Outside of it, they had no substance of their own. But I didn't worry. Because I had family, my wife, my children, my grandchildren. I thought that was enough. And for some years it seemed to be, until I realized something that scared me. My conversations had narrowed almost entirely to domestic logistics with my wife, and family gatherings where my role was increasingly that of a gentle extra, the grandfather who smiles, gives gifts, tells the same stories. I had nobody to talk to about what actually worried me. Nobody who knew me as an individual outside the role of husband, father, or grandfather. I remember a Saturday when I watched a documentary that moved me deeply and wanted to share it with someone. I looked at my phone and realized I had no one to call. Not because people had died or moved away, but because I had let every single bridge rot from disuse. Robert Waldinger, who directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development, they've been following people for over 85 years now, says something that should stop everyone in their tracks. The quality of your relationships is a stronger predictor of health and happiness in old age than wealth, than genetics, than any individual health habit. But Waldinger makes a distinction that I missed for years. Family relationships and friendships serve different psychological functions. Family gives you belonging and continuity. Friends give you something family rarely can: mutual choice and mirroring between equals. You don't choose your family. Your friends chose you, and you chose them. There's something irreplaceable in that. The AARP Foundation published research showing that roughly 1 in 3 adults over 65 experiences significant loneliness. And a major meta-analysis found that social isolation increases the risk of premature death by 26%, comparable to smoking. Loneliness in old age almost never happens because of a sudden event. It happens through slow, silent erosion, exactly what happened to me. If your list of friends you can have an honest, deep conversation with has shrunk to 0 or 1 in recent years, that doesn't reflect your worth as a person. It reflects a cruel reality of retirement that nobody announces clearly. Adult friendships require active effort that the routine of work disguised. When the routine disappears, only the friendships that were intentionally cultivated survive. And most of us never learned to cultivate friendships intentionally. I certainly didn't. Now, I should say something here. I know everyone's retirement is different. I'm not claiming my mistakes are universal. But in conversations with dozens of other retirees over the last 3 years, versions of these same patterns kept appearing with a frequency that can't be coincidence. If none of this resonates with you, I'm genuinely glad. But if 1 or 2 of these feel familiar, it might be worth paying attention. And the absence of friends isn't just loneliness. It contaminates something I only came to understand very late: the relationship with the person closest to us. My wife and I built a marriage of decades that worked well, but it worked well in a specific format. I left early, came back in the evening. We had weekends together and occasional vacations. There was longing in that rhythm. There was space. There was air. When I retired, I was home permanently. At first, it seemed good. More time together, more calm, more company. But over months, I started noticing signs I was slow to interpret. She'd close the bedroom door to read alone, something she'd never done before. She'd go for walks without inviting me. She'd get visibly irritated when I suggested we do everything together. I felt rejected and didn't understand why. I thought retirement would naturally bring us closer. It never occurred to me that closer and suffocating can look like the same thing from different angles. The conversation that changed everything happened one night after yet another tension over something trivial. She sat on the edge of the bed and said, "I love you, but I need you to understand something. I built a life during the years you were working. I have my routines, my friends, my schedule. When you retired, you didn't enter my life. You entered my space, and I'm suffocating." That conversation hurt more than I can describe, but it was the most important moment in our marriage in decades. I realized I'd made a double mistake. I'd never discussed with her what our shared routine would look like, and I'd unconsciously transferred onto her the responsibility of filling the void that work had left. She wasn't my activity. She was my companion, and I'd confused the two. Miriam Goodman, a couples therapist, wrote that retirement is often more disruptive to long marriages than to recent ones, precisely because long marriages have developed delicate balances that depended on the daily separation work provided. The Gottman Institute found that couples who don't explicitly renegotiate 3 things in the retirement transition: individual space, household responsibilities, and expectations of companionship, experience significant increases in conflict. The mistake is almost never a lack of love. It's the absence of a conversation nobody taught us to have. If retirement has brought unexpected tensions to your relationship, that doesn't mean the marriage is failing. It means the marriage is going through the biggest logistical and emotional reorganization since you first got together. And reorganizations of that magnitude need explicit conversation, the kind most of us have never had, and that most long marriages have learned to avoid. My wife and I are better now. We had the conversations we should have had before I retired. We renegotiated space, schedules, expectations. I leave the house some mornings not because I have somewhere to go, but because she needs the house for herself. And she tells me when she wants company, instead of me assuming she always does. It's not perfect, it's honest. And honest turns out to be much better than the polite suffocation we had before. She still teases me about the spice jars, by the way. Apparently, reorganizing your wife's kitchen without asking is grounds for a very specific kind of marital war. I've since learned to ask before touching anything in that kitchen. Some lessons cost more than others. But underneath all of these mistakes, the rest that became inertia, the body I neglected, the friendships I let die, the marriage I nearly suffocated, there was a more fundamental error feeding all the others. This is the hardest one to admit. Because it's not a mistake of action, it's a mistake of omission. During my entire professional life, the question, "What is my life for?" had an automatic answer: to provide for the family, to build a career, to contribute to society through work, to leave something for the children. When I retired, all those answers fell away at once. I didn't need to provide for anyone anymore. The career was over. The professional contribution had ceased. The children were established. And the question just sat there, naked, exposed, with no answer. But instead of facing it, I did what I suspect millions of people do. I avoided it. I filled my days with small occupations that created the illusion of purpose without ever having real purpose. Watching the news felt like being informed. Tidying the garage felt like being productive. Spending time with the grandchildren felt like being useful. None of these things is bad on its own. But when they're all you have, when they entirely replace the search for something that gives real meaning to your days, they become a sophisticated form of anesthesia. I spent more than 10 years anesthetized without realizing it. I only woke up when my granddaughter, with the innocent cruelty of a 12-year-old, asked me what I did all day and I couldn't answer. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps and wrote Man's Search for Meaning, argued that a human being can endure almost any how if they have a sufficient why. He described what he called the existential vacuum, the emptiness that comes when a person can't find meaning in their existence. And here's what struck me most when I read that. Frankl said this form of suffering is the most insidious because it doesn't present itself as sharp pain. It presents as chronic apathy, easily confused with contentment or acceptance. That was me, for over a decade, apathetic and calling it peaceful. More recent research by Patrick Hill at Washington University followed over 6,000 people for 14 years and found that having a sense of purpose in life predicted lower mortality at every age studied, with effects particularly strong among older adults. The question isn't having some grand purpose, it's having any genuine purpose, something that makes the difference between a day lived and a day that simply passed. If you're living your retirement without a clear sense of what your days are for, and if that absence shows up not as dramatic suffering, but as a diffuse apathy you sometimes mistake for peace, you're experiencing something profoundly human and frighteningly common. It's not laziness. It's not ingratitude. It's the predictable result of a lifetime in which purpose was given to us from the outside, by work, by responsibilities, by other people's expectations, and we never needed to build it from within. I know what some people might be thinking. This is depressing. I don't want to listen to someone listing regrets for 20 minutes. And I understand that reaction. But I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you'll do differently. Or, if you've already made the same mistakes, so you'll know you're not alone and that there's still a path forward. Not a perfect path, not a quick one, but a real one. I said earlier that I started writing in a notebook after my granddaughter's question. From those pages came not just the list of mistakes, but the beginning of something different. I shared those reflections with my wife first, then with one close friend, then with a small group of men and women my age who met weekly at a community center. And what I discovered changed something in me. I wasn't the only one. Almost everyone carried versions of the same mistakes and the same silence about them. Some of those conversations became real friendships, something I'd stopped building for over a decade. The notebook became a companion that helps me notice when I'm sliding back into inertia. I started making small, concrete changes. I won't pretend they were dramatic. At 78, some things don't come back. The knee I should have taken care of at 60 now limits what I can do. Friendships I let die through negligence during the first decade of retirement don't rebuild with a phone call. Time I spent on autopilot doesn't return. But I'm stronger than I was 3 years ago. I have conversations now that I didn't have before, real ones, about things that matter. My wife and I navigate our days with more honesty and more air between us. And I have something I didn't have at 75, the ability to choose how I live the years I have left, instead of simply letting them pass. There are still weeks when the feeling of uselessness shows up with force. Mornings when I wake up without wanting to do anything. I haven't conquered this. I manage it. And some days I manage it poorly. But the difference between managing poorly and sleepwalking through your life is the difference between a person who fell and a person who never tried to stand. At 78, I'm not an example of a successful retirement. I'm an example of late awareness. I made mistakes for over a decade before I saw them. I've corrected some in the last 3 years. Others I carry as scars that remind me daily of what could have been different. Remember the house? The house I furnished so carefully without ever checking the foundation? It's still standing. The cracks are there. I can see them now. Some of them can be repaired. Others are permanent reminders of what happens when you focus on the furniture and forget what holds everything up. But the house is still standing, and as long as it is, it's worth caring for what sustains it. Reinforcing a foundation takes more work now than it would have at the beginning, but it's still possible. And the work itself, the act of paying attention, of being honest, of showing up for the hard conversations and the uncomfortable truths, that work has given my days a weight they didn't have before. I have 78 years, and I don't have the luxury of saying time is on my side. But I have something I didn't have at 65. The honesty to recognize where I went wrong and the intention not to waste what I still have. If this is my legacy, let it be this. Not the pose of someone who got it all right, but the frankness of someone who got it wrong and still chose to keep going. The mistakes I made don't erase, but the days I still have don't need to repeat them. And if this video makes one person start living differently tomorrow, even just a little differently, then these 14 years of mistakes will have served something beyond myself. I'd love to know, if you could sit down with the version of yourself from 10 years ago and tell them one truth about retirement they didn't want to hear, what would it be? Write it in the comments. I'm certain someone here needs to read exactly what you're about to write. And if this kind of conversation matters to you, stay around. There's more to come.